Brothers and sisters, Gerontissa Makrina of blessed memory called our attention to the small things. Since this precision, she says, does what? This precision in the spiritual life squeezes the demons out of our lives. It gives them no place to grab onto and to pull us away from our Christian struggle. This week again, she issues the same call. Be attentive, brothers and sisters, in small things. But she explores the implications of being attentive from a different perspective this time from the point of view of our relationship with God. As we've said many times before, we must remember that in terms of our salvation, God himself has done all of the heavy lifting. When human nature lay wounded by sin, unable to take grace within himself and be united to God, it was God himself who came down and took on that very human nature, renewing it. When human nature was universally subject to death on account of his own sin, it was God incarnate who voluntarily suffered death and then rose again on the third day, giving us the resurrection. That is to say, the sure hope that passing through death, we will eventually again come to the fullness of life. So in objective terms then, our debt to God is unfathomable. It is so large, it is completely impossible for us to conceive of. We are always, brothers and sisters, going to be in debt to God. However, as we have also said many times, there is another side to the spiritual life and to salvation. One of the basic teachings of the Orthodox Church with respect to salvation is her teaching on synergy. That is to say that we are co-laborers with God in our salvation. He might, brothers and sisters, do the largest part, but we indeed have to do something. And that something is to struggle to live in accordance with the commandments. This act of trying to live like the commandments is like extending our hands forward in order to receive the great gift that God has prepared for us. Now, with respect to these things, Gerontissa suggests that we can, in a sense then, speak not only about debt before God, but also about paying our debt, so that we are in good standing before him. When it comes to the fulfillment of our part in this relationship, she says, we should not be like people who shop on credit. We should not be, she says, like people who shop on credit. Now we'll spend the rest of our time together today unpacking precisely what this means, or rather having Gerontissa unpack what this means for us. Now Gerontissa begins her explanation by painting the image of a store. She writes, "If I am in debt to a certain store, I will not be able to pass by there easily, because my conscience will convict me." Easy enough. Think about a practical example from our own lives. Imagine ourselves in a similar circumstance. Imagine, for example, that you owe some great debt to, we'll say, Costco. The manager knows, the cashier knows, maybe they have your picture up somewhere with the amount you owe written underneath it. If you go there then, how uncomfortable will you indeed be? The answer is, of course, not very comfortable. And Gerontissa then continues, "But when you do not owe to the store owner, and you pass by, he will call out to you, and he'll say, 'Come in, whatever you like, this I will give to you.' When we are good customers then, when our debts are paid, the experience is better, and we'll be given what we need. In the same manner, or at least in a similar manner," Gerontissa says, "we should apply this teaching to our relationship with God. We ought to strive not to be in debt to God. We ought to strive not to be in debt to God with respect to our spiritual responsibilities. Of course, as we said in the big picture, we are always going to owe God for the great things that he has done for us, for his constant help and grace and the aid in the small things in our Christian struggle. But with respect to our basic, fundamental Christian duties, the daily application of the gospel, we should try, brothers and sisters, not to be in debt. when we struggle to do these things, when we struggle to fulfill our basic spiritual responsibilities, we, in a sense, then, Gerontissa says, break even. When we fail, we go into debt. She writes, we should not leave our debt unpaid to the true God. When you owe him, what can he give you? He will say to you, you ask me for gifts, and yet you owe me. Owe no man anything but to love one another. St. Paul writes, do not have debts, in other words, before men, except the debt of love. And if we should owe nothing to men, how much more should we then owe nothing in these things toward God? And what are the things that we owe to God, brothers and sisters, in the spiritual life? What are these basic things Gerontissa is talking about? She lists a few for us. As always, and it should be very familiar to us, I would suggest by now, she begins specifically with the prayer rule. Prayer rule debt, she writes, never ends. For one to owe their daily prayers is due to indifference, not because of a lack of time. To owe, that is, to have not fulfilled one's duty with respect to his prayer rule, she says, is due to indifference, not because of a lack of time. There's a very, very important story from the monastic tradition, wherein a sister, on account of negligence throughout her life, missed a great very many of her daily prayer rules. And God, in his mercy, at the end of her life, would not let her soul depart from her body until what happened? Until her sisterhood, the nuns around her, out of love, decided that they would make up what she missed throughout her whole life. And so they began to do prostrations and to do prayer rules over and over and over again. Until what point? Until that debt had been paid and she was able to go to God without that debt on her soul. So we shouldn't then owe with respect to our prayer rule. Because, as Gerontissa says, owing with respect to our prayer rule is a sign of indifference, not the sign of a lack of time. What else? We have to, brothers and sisters, be at the Divine Liturgy on Sundays and feast days. And, she says, we have to not only be there physically, but we have to be there spiritually. She writes, those who are pious pay attention to the words that are being said and prayed, and their mind is on prayer the whole time they're at Divine Liturgy. We don't move around a lot. We try to stay in one place as far as is possible, unless, as Gerontissa points out, we have some health problem, or we have some need to move. Maybe we're falling asleep or something like that, and we need to shift around to keep ourselves awake. But generally, we try to be there physically and spiritually, and in our physical being, we should be still and quiet. We shouldn't speak in church. We should wait for the service to finish. Now, to these basic things, which I think should be probably well known to us, and things that I think we know in the deepness of our heart, we have no reason to fall into debt before God with respect to them. Gerontissa adds a few other small things. Again, she emphasizes tiny, tiny elements of the spiritual life. There's going to be lots of areas in our life where we fall into debt before God because of temptation. We fall into big sins. But there's many small things which lie basically within our power to do. And so it's best for us to acknowledge this and to do those small things as often as we possibly can, and at least not to fall into debt there needlessly. What does she say about these tiny things? When we take Antidorun, she says, when we come up to receive the blessed bread that has gone through the service of the proskymedia at the end of the service, we should receive it, she says, with the fear of God, with much precision, with great piety, so that not even a single crumb should fall to the ground. And she then bears witness to the grace that comes from receiving this thing. Sometimes we just pass through the line and we forget what it is, that we're actually receiving something significant. This is what she says about Antidorun. Many people who partake of the Antidorun are overwhelmed with grace, as if they've received Holy Communion. And she reminds us also to be careful when we venerate icons. Again, a small thing. We'll make a bow, she says, and we'll venerate the icons. We should pay attention when venerating the icons to venerate the feet of Christ and the hands of the Theotokos. It is not permissible, she says, to kiss the face of Christ or the Theotokos. Otherwise, we become bold. Now, in our case, we have in our iconostaphs the icon not made by hands, which is, of course, the whole of the face of Christ. However, we can venerate it closer to the corner, or on the mandilion that goes around it, so as not to kiss Christ on the face directly. Because, as Gerontissa says, when we are careless in the way we venerate the icons, we start to become bold and proud in our relationship towards God. When we're careful, it develops piety within us and the fear of God. Whoever is faithful, brothers and sisters, in small things is also faithful in much. We don't need to fall into debt before God needlessly over these small things when we know, brothers and sisters, that we all have such large debts before God. So in the broader sense, then, we know, and we always know, that we're going to be indebted to God for our salvation, for his constant grace and mercy and protection over us. But in a smaller picture, with respect to those small spiritual duties, which are an indication of our good disposition towards God, in these things, brothers and sisters, we need to avoid debt, spiritual debt. We shouldn't do and then connected to this thought is something which is deeply important to our tradition. Every single night, what do? We're expected to do our spiritual accounting at the end of the day. We're expected to find out, did we fulfill our basic spiritual obligations or not? We run through our day and see, am I even with God, or have I fallen away from doing what it is I'm supposed to do? We do our spiritual accounting. And did we break even? Do we do this analysis and somehow feel that we've broken even? Then start to do more detailed analysis. Yes, indeed, I did my prayers, but was my heart in my prayers when I did them? Yes, I went to church, but was I there just in body, while my soul floated around outside the walls to the various places my imagination took it? Yes, I did my duties, but did I do these things carefully? Did we truly then break even? Becomes the question for us. And if we find, as I suspect most of us will, when we do this kind of spiritual accounting that breeds humility before God and the recognition of the need for his grace in our life, if we fall short, there is for us the mystery of repentance and confession. But it should always be our aim, first and foremost, not to be like those kind of people, as Gerontissa says, who live and shop on spiritual credit. It should be our aim to be up to date with our spiritual duties as best we can. Our aim should be to break even with respect to these things. Amen.